first. Would you like to respond first?
Well, just, I mean, you're quite right to draw that parallel between the two figures. But I'm indebted to you for pointing out not simply the parallel, which I'm aware of, but the resonance, which I had not thought about. I mean, the resonance down to the words themselves is kind of fascinating, and one that I will employ. I think Roy is absolutely right about the motivations ongoing here. The object, I mean, I said that this paper was one of a series of experiments in how to think about coming to write a book, and it's a way of going about an exercise in historical research that I have not before chosen. That is, to some extent, I have often been the kind of historian who, and here I'll invoke someone who I won't say detest, but with whom I have great difficulty, E.P. Thompson, who talked of the historian as a sort of parachutist who would, you know, jump out of a plane in the dark at night and land in a forest, and that the object was to sort of first you walk a couple of yards in this direction and a couple of yards in that direction, and you gradually orient yourself to where you are, and you become familiar with the immediate surrounds, and it's a military metaphor, obviously, and you become familiar with your immediate surrounds, and you gradually come to know the terrain upon which you have landed. And this is sort of Thompson's metaphor for engaging in archival research, and it's a sort of the prototypical and in many ways an intensely traditional exercise in landing in an archive free of presupposition and acquainting oneself with what one finds and allowing one's historical consciousness to be formed in part from that process of discovery. And that is something that I wish not completely not to do in this particular case. I am actually engaged in the exercise of trying to think about how to write this history before engaging in any detailed archival research. And much of that process of engaging with Turner is to try to take a sort of prototypically inarticulate person, a slave, deadly seriously as an intellect to be discovered. And this particular intellect has left a trace in the pamphlet that Styron, from which Styron took his title, The Confessions of Nat Turner, which I talk about a little bit in the paper, which itself is, of course, is an extraordinarily compromised source because it's a pamphlet purportedly written on the basis of a series of conversations taking place in camera between two people, the author of the pamphlet, the impoverished Southampton County Attorney Thomas Ruffin Gray, and Nat Turner, to which nobody else was privy, which Gray then rushes off to copyright and to publish several days after Turner is executed. So the intellect has left this source, but it's a source that one has to approach with caution for those very obvious reasons. And much of the work that I have been doing has simply been trying to grapple with how to use this source. But I think everything that Roy has said about both the way that I am approaching history, historical imagination, the work that history should do is all, absolutely, it's correct. It's a correct representation. I didn't hear anything that I would disagree with at all. And it's certainly, it is the case, I think, that the enemy, the villain of the piece, as Roy put it, is a form of historicism that is rigorously anti-metaphysical. So I'll just stop there, and let's see what.
So we already have a fairly long list. I'll read the people that I have so you know. Anat, Liora, Andreas, Asaf, Nen, and Levi. And we go one by one. Anat. Okay. But the microphone. Asaf.
Thank you. So you surprised me when you said, when we spoke about this article at dinner, I realized how central the idea of understanding Turner was in this paper. But it's not entirely, I mean, you drop hints, but it's not entirely, you never get to Turner, finally. Mm-hmm. The experience of deferral in the paper seems really central. And I'm wondering whether that deferral is part of the philosophy of history here. Whether is this just a preliminary to, as you say, an archival project which you have not yet done, or is this part of your way of understanding Turner, that statement of keeping a very felt distance?
I think part of the process of trying to understand Turner is to try to understand other people who've tried to understand Turner. And William Styron tries to understand Turner. So I want to understand the terms upon which William Styron tries to understand Turner as part of my exercise of trying to understand him. And so the paper is predominantly a critique of how Turner has been understood by one of the people in the last 50 years who tried hardest, in a way, to understand him, which was Styron. There are points in the paper where I cite other historians who have gestured toward representations of Turner that they find satisfactory. That is, that they find satisfactory historical representations of Turner, and they are entirely banal and entirely superficial. So to that extent, Styron's is a more measured and consistent engagement in understanding, which I believe still fails, and fails fairly profoundly. And I'm interested in that failure, and I attribute the failure to Styron's desire to make Turner comprehensible on his own terms, which I think is impossible. So in a sense, you could say that, talking about kind of traditional historical exercises, you could say this is sort of like the traditional historical exercise of ground clearing. This is the PhD candidate who begins by throwing a hand grenade into the room and blowing up all of the old farts who have written about this particular subject before, and killing them off, and then there's room for you to move in yourself. I don't think I quite have to do that, but I do want to introduce the terms on which I engage with Turner by clearing the ground, by discussing others who have tried to understand him. So I'm not deferring Turner. This paper actually isn't really about Turner. This paper is about an attempt to understand Turner, which I think failed.
So, no, okay. Yes, so Liora.
Okay, Chris,
Mike.
to bring you back to law.
Liora, the mic.
To
I
law.
want to law.
Yeah, law's
because
missing here.
yes, because there is history and literature, but there is no law there. And I wanted to because I was. It was interesting to me this idea that in order to understand the past and the atrocity and the violence, you have to misunderstand the man, Nat Turner. There was one possibility of getting to the past in this way. And I was thinking about the law, and especially the criminal law, of what it does by getting to the individual, trying really hard to understand his or her motivation, thoughts, feelings. And in this way, it's a kind of historicism that tends, according to this, to completely erase the context, the bigger. So in one way, the loss falls under this historicism that you resist. But on the other, there is always this present-past constellation in the law, because of why we get to the past is through a present problem that we have. Somebody was murdered, we have to bring peace to society and so forth. So it's never just a pure interest in the past. So I was wondering what your idea of constellation and what your idea about time has to do with the law. So it's just an invitation to think about the implication of what you are telling us here about historiography, to think about the relationship to the law.
Well, actually, the last couple of days have been very helpful to me in that regard, because one of the problems that I have been kind of grappling with as I have gone through this sort of exercise of writing serial working papers on Turner and the Turner Rebellion is trying to figure out what I want this work to say about law. And it's not easy. One can write about law at a kind of superficial and institutional level, about the law of the particular trial that took place. And I think I'm going to do some of that, although not a lot of that. I could be doing that more in this particular paper, because one of the things that Styron is concerned with in his, he has two, if you talk about villains, I mentioned this in the paper, he has two villains. One is religion and the other is law. And really he concentrates on the religious villain. But the first section of the book is a fairly vehement assault upon legal process in the form of a critique of an account of Turner's own trial, which I think this paper should deal with much more fully than it does. In the broader sense, though, I don't know that is the place for law in the research. I'm really, Andreas's lawscape articulates my own sense, which I had not put in those terms, of where law belongs in the story of the Turner Rebellion, because one is dealing with a normalized terrain, a terrain that is normalized by law, to the point where, in your terms, it is virtually atmosphere. That is, law kind of disappears because it is all pervasive. It is so pervasive, it has disappeared. One doesn't notice it any longer. One of the things that the rebellion does is to pull it back into being, into focus. And I think that it's in that regard that I think it's in that way that I find the point of purchase upon law that I want this research to around which this research will gel insofar as it is legal history. And I think it's that rather than, I mean, there is this interesting article by, I've forgotten his first name, his second name is Fabricant, written in the early 1990s, which is actually about Styron and Nat Turner and Nat Turner's trial, and that article is an attempt to show how the trial does not comport with, antebellum Virginia legal process, criminal legal process. So, and I think that is kind of that is interesting up to a point, but that's not the kind of way in which I think an engagement with legal history can go. I like the lawscape much better.
It's my turn to ask.
Yeah.
Yeah, because since I managed to sell you the lawscape, can I manage to sell you justice too, or is that your limit?
I'm not sure about
yeah,
that.
I know. Okay.
Don't push it.
Yeah, well, so because you do mention, I mean, the question is not about justice, but the question is about the here, and you do mention Lucie Rigaret and her work on the kind of the replacement of the différance and her understanding of sort of bringing the presence into the line. And that, I think, and you look at the here and the now by Rigaret as the relational, which I think is quite right in the context of the sexual difference that she's looking at. But there's, I think there's the here is also this moment of kind of, as it were, consolidation. I want, or kind of the moment of appearance of a historical sort of vibration, which is I mean, to a large extent, is the constellation, to constellate, is the constellation between the Benjaminian constellation that you're following. And I wonder whether, okay, so there are two questions. So first is whether the here has any role in what you're doing, and whether the here, not necessarily in the spatialization sense, but in the sense of the vibratory moment of the density of the constellation. And the second thing that I wanted to ask is this: I'm really attracted by this kind of flirting with epistemology. I mean, Roy called it methodology. I would even go further into this epistemological kind of constellation, which is also a very strong ontological gesture. I mean, it is about kind of not just the usual rewriting the past, but actually rewriting, rethinking, re-putting together. These things that are often kept different for different reasons. So from deconstruction, they're kept differently, and from classical historicism, they're kept differently. But it's really quite fascinating how they both converge into this difference. So what you're doing is actually you're putting it and you're really holding them together. So I'm just wondering whether you would go all the way and say that this is kind of that you're offering a sort of an ontology there.
To the extent I understand the question, I would say that my sort of intellectual goal is to render as one, or as much as possible as one, the philosophy and the history, such that, in what I was talking about, professional history, in American professional history, in America's professionalization of history, that is in historical training, one might say philosophy of history is something that is rigorously thrown away, kept aside. This is a highly Anglophone empirical tradition of work, and I desire to render my history philosophical as well as my philosophy historical, and to make the presentation of a history also the presentation of a philosophy, of a way of understanding. On the first part of your question, that is on the, this is something I've been thinking about quite recently, because the next paper in this sort of series of preliminaries, false starts, you might say, a series of false starts. The next paper in this series of false starts is one that has to be, I think, about violence. I'm quite conscious that in what I've done up to now, I have been engaged in a work of rehabilitation. That is, I am trying to present Turner as an intellect that is worthy of very, very serious attention. But in part, I've done that because I've done that in a way that avoids, or in the wonderful phrase that Ravid quoted from the daughter, the German daughter. I'm learning around the past. So I'm learning around the violent bit. I've evaded the violence in order to rehabilitate the person. But it's actually in the violence that I think is the most concentrated moment. That the most concentrated moment of action here is the violence itself. It's the violence of the rebellion. And it's kind of interesting to me that in the pamphlet, in Gray's pamphlet, and I've treated I have a very kind of close reading of the pamphlet. The pamphlet is very interesting. The pamphlet is the text of the pamphlet basically falls into two distinct parts. There is that part which is an account of Turner's life. And the way it is written is completely distinct from that part of the pamphlet which is about the rebellion. The part that is about Turner's life is written very roughly. There's very little formal punctuation. The sentences are hurried. They kind of pile into each other. When you get to the part that's about the rebellion, it reads like it's prepared writing, which I think actually it falls into that part which Gray had written before and that part which he wrote as a result of the conversations that he had. Nevertheless, there's another way of reading the part that is the part about the rebellion itself, that is the part that is very cool, calm, rational, calculated, that you could say, well, this is temporally, this takes a very concentrated period of action and squeezes it into this extraordinarily condensed ball of words, which are very tightly organized. And that expresses a kind of an utter immediacy that is almost an everlasting moment, if you see what I mean. It's both constricted and it never stops, because it relentlessly proceeds. And so...
Careful, that's close to the metaphysics of present.
Well, this is. I mean, in the kind of Benjaminian sense, this is the everlasting moment. This is the everlasting pause. I mean, Benjamin is fascinated by moments when things stop, when things pause, when they freeze. The dialectical image is dialectics at a standstill. It does not proceed. It is the set of fragments, the image fallen into a crystal. And in the crystal you see everything, because as he says, the crystallization of the total event. And it's in the account of the rebellion, which is the account of its violence, you can read it as the crystallization of a total event. So I think that is my sort of my response to the first part of your question.
Okay, so Asaf?
So, this kind of first point is something that actually I think came up already in Roy's comment. I was kind of struck. I really admire you're one of the very few legal historians that really tries to think explicitly about methodology, certainly in the United States, and I really kind of admire the attempt, but I was struck by, in the paper itself, I was struck by the difficulty of overcoming contextualization and historicizing, about Styron, not about kind of, the story you tell about Styron is kind of, you to say, well, it was the 1960s, he grew up in the South, it was the 1960s, and it's kind of, can't really escape in a way the historian's craft when talking about, as it's his practice today, well, when you're talking about him. So I was really kind of curious to see that even when you're trying to overcome it, you cannot really do so, or at least when you're not really thinking about it. So second thing I wanted to raise, it actually goes to Roy's point more than to the paper itself, is Roy's demand for moral clarity at the end of his comment, which kind of, and it also ties to Lior's point about law. So one thing that kind of you see in this conference is kind of, when you think about the arts and you kind of try to contrast the arts versus law versus history. So you see in what Lior said yesterday about Oedipus, also about the flat today, it's kind of the proper mode of doing literature or the arts generally is to complexify and to say there are no heroes and villains, and it's all very complex because you've got these Jews who are also not partly Nazis, or you've got this, Oedipus also is a victim, but also, and law is not about that, right? Law is about the binary, kind of. So actually what you are doing is legal history. So I don't like moral clarity, first of all. And secondly, what you're doing is legal history, not in the sense that it's about law, in the sense it's kind of Siegen, in the sense that you're trying to kind of overcome the complexity and say there is black and white. I'm not very happy with that, but that's because I'm an old conservative. I'm one of these people who are going to die when you throw the grenade in and kind of into the water.
Because it's a little bit too hard to live with the moral clarity of our lives, which I don't think there is moral clarity, which is monstrous.
Are complexity and clarity mutually exclusive?
I think so.
I think they have. In my, in the stuff that I've written about this, I claim that they have become. That they have become so. I don't think it's necessarily the case, but I think that they have become so. I think as I see history moving from a caution about causality to a deep suspicion of causal claims, to a suspicion of explanation, a concentration on narration, and a commitment to fetishizing complexity for its own sake. I think in that series of moves, which I think corresponds with the move from structuralism to deep post-structuralism, I think complexity and clarity have become completely distinct. That is, become opposites almost.
Not moral clarity necessarily, right?
Not necessarily, but kind of in practice, as we have moved to the fetishizing of complexity, so we have given up on, I think, on moral let's say moral clarification.
Responsibility.
Yeah.
No. No, Chris can answer, but we still have some people waiting very politely. Chris, do you want to go on, or shall we
No,
move
no,
to Nan?
no. Just go
Okay,
ahead.
so Nan.
Thank you. So I'll try to be brief. So I wanted to ask you about why you took Styron's claim that this was a meditation on history seriously. Because I think, I mean, Leora said that you had the literature and you had the history, but you didn't have the law. But I actually wonder whether you have the literature. I didn't see. I think I think one thing that would help would be to reintegrate some of this discussion into the literary scholarship on slave narratives, and take the fact that Styron's piece is a novel much more seriously than his statement that it was a meditation on history. Which you then, I mean, when you talk about Lukács, you reveal somehow that he doesn't really understand what that could possibly have meant. So I think if you go into the scholarship on the literary scholarship, that is to say, on slave narratives, then you will also be wanting to bring in the question of the inarticulacy of the slave and the layers of inauthenticity that go along with every slave narrative. The sort of the presumption that the slave didn't write the narrative because slaves can't write, to the re-presumption that the slave really did write the narrative because slaves can write and think to boot. And I think I mean thinking about like Frederick Douglass's two narratives would be helpful in this regard, especially given the suggestion you just made about going into violence in the next piece, right? Because I mean, in his two autobiographies, I mean, the idea of autobiography also has to come into this as well, right? I mean, it's the confessions of Nat Turner, and it's the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, a slave, and it's the autobiography of Henry Box Brown, and it's the
Sorry, then to part of some fiction, the autobiography of the next colored man, right? I mean, put it
the autobiography of the next colored man, which is complete fiction, which was written by a black man. So exactly. So I think the idea of genre. I think you want to bring in genre. I think there's much more literature that needs to come in terms of the understanding of history here. Literary history has to.
Complexity becomes engagement with textual particularity, then I don't think it needs to be opposed to. Okay. It doesn't need to be the alternative to any sense of historical meaningfulness, and that's the thing that's seen, and it doesn't have to be part of this trajectory toward a version of post-structuralism, an account of post-structuralism that means that all you're saying are the principles of post-structuralism and not doing any version of the modes of textual engagement that actually were made possible by those insights.
So Chris, this would be also your wrap-up.
Oh. Okay. On the matter then of why take Styron's claim that his is a meditation on history so seriously, I take it seriously because it's basically the one thing that he just refuses to give up on. For 40 years. For 40 years, this is a consistent claim. It's one that he can't explain. He tries endlessly to explain it, and he explains it in one fashion and another fashion. And as I said, he kind of picks up Lukács after the fact, and he kind of waves that around. I mean, in part, he's waving Lukács around because, as he says, Lukács is a Marxist. which means that when he's dishing on Aptheker, he's trying to dish on Aptheker by flourishing a Marxist. I think, I mean, to engage with literary scholarship on slave narratives, with Douglas's autobiography, and so, etc. Yes, I think that's crucial. I'm not sure this is the place to do it. In that, because I think that this piece is about how Turner got presented to an audience this is the most complete presentation of Turner to an American audience there has been. This is an enormously successful book in commercial terms. It's a hugely controversial book, which makes it an enormously successful book.
But it is not a history.
Well, it is an attempt. It is an attempt, at least in part. One of the poles between which it oscillates is a claim about history. The other is a claim about literary imagination. Neither of them are particularly convincing, but those are the poles and the terms of the discussion that Styron sets up for it. So, yeah, of course.
There's a whole history that Styron's plugging into of American literary scholarship that presents itself as historical.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a 3 century. Yeah, I'm aware of. There's we could start with Daniel Defoe if you want,
but I think that's what he's doing. I think that's what Styron's doing. I mean, I think and it's the same thing that the slave narratives were doing. So I think that's why he didn't give it up. I mean, I think it was a literary move. It was a literary move.
I think it's an intellectual move. I'm not sure.
Yes, it's an intellectual move. No, I mean, of course.
But I mean, it's an intellectual move that okay. Well.
But I think it's part of literature. Is part of the
stop
history.
Because we want to have a break and we want to have another session and then we want to have lunch and then we want to have another session.
Is it you?
No.